Good afternoon to everybody signing on. We're going to wait just a few more seconds here and give everyone a chance to get ready for our program today. Thank everyone for joining us today. If you want to share with us where you're joining from today, we'd love to hear. If you're joining us from New England or abroad or another state, we'd like to say hello. Okay, well, I think we're going to go ahead and kick things off. I'm going to do a brief introduction here before we start our program. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Sharon Reed. I'm the Programs and Events Coordinator here at the Hood Museum of Art. And we are bringing you today a program that is part of a series known as Conversations and Connections. And we invite you to join in the discussion with us. The program will run about 1 hour and we will have time for Q&A. Please don't wait until the end to ask your question. Pop it into the chat or the Q&A feature and we will get to as many as possible during the allotted time. I would like to say we will have subtitles on during today's program. If you do choose to turn them off, I will put directions in the chat on how to do that. And today's session is also being recorded and will be available on the Hood Museum of Art's YouTube channel in the coming days. If you have any questions at all or issues, just please pop it in the chat. We'll be happy to help you out. So today I'd like to introduce you to our virtual conversations and connections. And we have with us today Nomusa Makhubu. Apologize for my pronunciation. And she's going to be in conversation with Isadora, Italia, who is our campus engagement manager here at the museum. And Isadora is also the curator of a current exhibition in which Nomusa's work is featured called Embodied, Artist as Medium. Isadora?
Thank you so much, Sharon, for kicking us off and for all that you do for Hood Museum programming. And thank you all for joining us today. Welcome. My name is Isadora Italia, and I am the Campus Engagement Manager at the Hood Museum of Art. And I am thrilled to be hosting today's Conversations and Connections with artist Nomusa Makhubu. Nomusa's photograph, Umasif Fanisane 2, Comparison 2, is currently on view in an exhibition I curated titled Embodied, Artist as Medium. And I'm really excited to have the opportunity to share this work with our audiences and to speak with you, Nomusa, about the larger photographic series that is a part of the truthfulness of images and the power of performative photography. So thank you for being here with us today. Nomusa Makhubu is a visual artist and associate professor in art history and visual culture at the University of Cape Town. Her research covers African popular culture, performance art, photography, and political engagement in art. Makhubu's contributions to African studies have been recognized by the African Studies Association and with a fellowship at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard. Her photography-based artworks have been exhibited internationally, and in 2014, she won the Prix du Studio National des Arts Contemporains at the Dakar Biennale. Makhubu's self-portrait series was acquired by the Hood Museum's former curator of African art, Smooth Nzewi, in 2014, and those 13 photographs have been used in both exhibitions and for teaching since. As I mentioned, one is currently on view in Embodied through December 17th, And 6 were on view in 2020 as part of the exhibition Reconstitution, which was curated by our former associate curator of global contemporary art, Jessica Hong. And several photos will be on view in a 2024 exhibition, Homecoming, Domesticity and Kinfulness in Global African Art, curated by curatorial research associate Alexandra Thomas. So we're big fans of your work and of the series. The works are incredibly rich, and they open up conversations about colonialism, ethnographic photography, womanhood, performance, politically charged imagery. We're constantly pulling them for Dartmouth classes to look at as part of their curriculum in our Center for Object Study. The images are not only thought-provoking, but they're also very legible. And I find that the students I work with really get what you're trying to say. And I think that's a testament to you, Nomusa, and your ability to communicate complex ideas so clearly. So thank you again. And I'd love, to open it up by just asking you to tell us how this project started, the self-portrait project.
Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me. It's really wonderful to be part of this conversation. I haven't had an opportunity to talk about the work in a very long time, as you can imagine. I think there was a time when I did a lot of presentations about it, but so it's really great to be able to reflect again on this series of work. Okay, so where it started, the self-portrait series was originally part of a body of work that was called Preserved, which was a project that I'd started when I was looking at a display in museums in a place called Makhanda in the Eastern Cape. And at the time, it was kind of a very sort of small space, very basic, and it separated its display of what it termed or categorized at the time as the 1820 settler display, and then on the other side was for the posa objects. And so I worked with some of the material there, until eventually I thought, I can't seem to find what I'm looking for. And what I was looking for at the time was the kind of archive that spoke, or at least had a little bit more resonance in terms of my own cultural identity. And I couldn't find it. So I started looking, and I looked in books, I searched. And almost everywhere I came, there was this recurrence of the colonial photograph. And part of my digging was, yes, both in terms of what we find in museums, what we find in archives, but it was also what we find in the family photograph, the family photo album. So I was looking at my family photo album, and I was thinking, there's sort of very different languages or photographic languages, what you see in these photographic album, in the family photo album, and what you see in the colonial photograph. So I was very interested in how those languages work and how it was possible to disturb them. And I remember when I started, I couldn't figure out, how do I go about undoing this image or making it speak a different language, or sort of giving different meanings to what it's saying. And finding a way to deal with what is otherwise a very denigrating and very difficult history. So, and understanding what it is that we actually confronted with. So initially I would stage things. I remember, I used to place objects and then project the image. And for me, I think the projection was really an interesting way to experiment, because it kind of changed the way that we look at what is the object of the photograph to a simulation. So suddenly you had something that was, a little less solid, something that seems to be easy to interrupt. And I would place objects and take photographs, and eventually then realize, actually, here's a space that is created in this projection. There's a space that's created for performance. of course, here I then collaborated with League, who then worked with me in terms of producing the final images with myself in the image. I mean, I think when I started, I couldn't have imagined that I would be myself in the image. So I think at that point, after all of those experimentations, we ended up thinking about what does it mean to not just work with the photograph as we find it, but then also introduce how the body is experienced, how the photograph is experienced physically. And not necessarily that was particularly a comfortable space to be in, because of course, when you encounter the photograph, what seems to be apparent is this relationship between photographer and the photographed. And here, when you think about, how does that relationship look like? Or what would it have looked like in the early 1900s when it was taken? Right. And again, so it opens up those really uncomfortable, uneasy questions about the process of taking a colonial photograph, but also this sort of situationing of the subject, which was particularly interesting. But perhaps maybe let me just leave it at that for now.
Yeah. No, thank you. And you bring up a good point about power dynamics and positionality and perspective. And you said in a 2015 interview that I read, quote, performed photography in which the archive or historical as well as canonical photographic imagery is appropriated functions as a necessary interruption and a powerful assertion. So could you expand on that idea of performative photography and the power that it holds?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it was also, I was working in those early years, following the end of the apartheid era. So perhaps my framing of performative photography, I must admit, I do find it a little bit of an awkward phrasing, performative photography, but I was trying to find a way to talk about the strategies that were taken up by a number of artists who were working in that political transition between apartheid and post-apartheid. And it was a time when, it was really important to kind of dwell on the question of identity, not only because the apartheid era functioned in such a way that we were almost always aware of our racial identities, our gendered identities. But I think following the apartheid era, there was also this questioning of particularly ethnic identities. So in this instance, it might have been, the idea of like, it's Swati. So, and I am Umswati. And I was trying to figure out, what would that mean if one were to, in images, how do you reenact it? How do you perform it? And of course, it's impossible because you have a history that has produced and constructed ethnic identities, which we then reenact, so, and I think it was just being playful in that space. So that notion of performative photography was to speak to the way in which older photographs, not just from the colonial era, but also from the apartheid era, were being reused, reconfigured, reenacted. And that reenactment was not necessarily to reinforce the power dynamics, but to question how visual images shape the social imaginary, especially in the way that we perceive what our identities should be. So I think that, I think that strategy was it was a necessary interruption, I guess one can think about it as a way to rupture the image. Because some images sort of stay in our social imaginary, especially colonial imagery. People can talk about, sepia-toned images. You kind of have a particular idea of what is being spoken about. And so there are ideas that sort of solidify, especially when it comes to identities. And I guess what I was trying to allude to was that period of working where artists were working with this material, but in a way that subverts it, in a way that makes you look again. And I think that was more or less, I think in that interview, that's what I was trying to get to. That, in some ways, when we perform, we do something different. We change the currency of the image. We change the meanings of the image, or at least we hope to. But that was the question around the performance. And again, it's not to say, I mean, I know that the reason why I'm saying it's such an awkward phrasing. I mean, it's always assumed that photography is always performed, so you don't need to necessarily say performed photography. But sometimes when we talk about photography, we think about it as not necessarily performed, as more documentary. Cameras just record whatever's in front of the mechanical thing. But I think there was a particular artistic strategy that I was trying to speak to.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you say, to interrupt the image and to open up a new space, I think that's one of the things that really struck me about this series is you're using these ethnographic photographs and making us think about, what they contain and their history, and asking us to think about your contemporary presence and everything in between. So, I just think they're incredibly powerful in that way. The self-portrait project, I believe, is comprised of 13 images. What was your process in selecting those 13 out of the research that you did in archives, in family albums? What was behind sort of your decision making and including something or not including something?
Yeah, I just, as you were commenting on my last response, I just thought of something else, and I'm wondering if I can say that before I answer the question that you're asking.
You can say whatever you want.
So there was a conversation that happened years ago, where I think I was in a seminar and I was talking about this work, and somebody said, "Oh, I recognize the kangas that the women are wearing," and so, I mean, this was, again, it's touching on the question of performance. And they're saying, "Oh, I recognize the kangas. These wouldn't have been done in the sort of early 20th century. They would have been more recent." And he says, so what one can ascertain from that is that possibly these photographs were themselves performed. And so, there's a photographer who was trying to produce a particular kind of aesthetic. And so that it was taken much later. It was way after slavery was abolished. So they couldn't have been slaves. And so this photograph itself was performed. And what that pinpointed to me was actually, if you look at the backdrops, you start to notice that almost all the backdrops are painted. So it's like there's a whole stage setting. There's a whole theatrical aspect to the colonial photograph that was particularly interesting. So I guess, yes, there's both, in terms of the performed photograph, was the intertwining of what happens, of what the strategies that artists were taking on after apartheid, but also thinking about the photograph itself as staged. This is the image I was talking about. The photograph itself is staged, right? And I thought that was particularly interesting because we often we never kind of discern the fictions that we're confronted with when we look at photography from the 20th century. Okay, so how did I select the 13 images? I think, I mean, this was a long process, and as I mentioned, there were photographs that contained only just objects that were placed, in front of the projector, and all kinds of other experimentations. But I think in the end, my project then became about particularly women. and women subjects in front of the camera. Of course, there are some where you see men, for example, the one in Basha Ibaibeli, which is, it's more around the sort of, it represents the transition between, indigenous traditions to the educated, quote unquote, civilized subject. And yeah, so I mean, I think at some point I started to think, okay, what is it for me that really seems to be particularly important about what I'm looking to say about these photographs? And to me, it started I started to see a theme around how the rule and the divide and rule tactics of British colonialism constructed particular ethnicities through a number of ideological instruments, and among them photography, but also how this sort of transition, the expectation that, one would move or shift from being this sort of traditional subject to being a civilized subject. And you'll notice many of the photographs are this sort of shifting from this idea of this idyllic mythic past of particular tribes. Even in the inscriptions on the photographs, you see, the Zulu mothers or Zulu women or Zulu woman waiting for her lover. And then the others, you clearly see very different garb that's being depicted. So it's a very kind of careful staging of particular ideas about Black identities from a colonial perspective. So when I started selecting, I looked at particularly the representation of women and children, and I was then looking at what is this sort of transition that's also being presented by these images between traditional garb and what's not traditional garb. But yeah, those were part of the sort of main considerations that were important to me.
Thank you. And I think, maybe it's a good time to talk about comparison 1 and comparison 2. And I think looping, there's a slide that has them both side by side, because they're not merely portraits of women and children, but they're also documents of albinism. So maybe you could talk a little bit about these two images. Was it important to have something like albinism represented in the series?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me it was an interesting find to find this image. I mean, I remember just sitting with it, looking at it, for a very long time. And it was like, and I mean, I remember with this one, there was a time when I posed in the position of the mother, and then there was the one where I posed in the position of the child who has this, I think this particular skin condition is vitiligo. But yes, albinism as well, of course, is something that there were images of. And I think it points to the epidermalization of race. Obviously, these photographs, have a particular gaze on specifically the Black body. And it was quite interesting that where they have an image of a mother who is dressed in what they would see as the civilized, Christianized garb, standing next to the child who has the skin condition, but is wearing a beaded skirt, right? And I thought it was quite an interesting, it must have been, I mean, I usually sit with this image and I try to imagine what must have been happening in the mind of both of both the mother and the child, and what must have been happening in the mind of the photographer, right? So they could, both of them could have been dressed in pleated skirts. They both could have been in dresses, and it seemed to me like there was quite an intentional juxtaposition. But it also spoke to this question around the epidermalization of race and this idea of these shifts and transitions that were part and parcel of colonizing both the mind and body of the African. And so although it is about, yes, albinism is in itself a disease, it's, and we don't have this sort of question of course, race is a question, but of course, on the surface, when we think about the epidermalization of race, that's the first thing people think about, that race is signified by how we read your body. Your body is inscribed in terms of what they see on the surface. And it was quite interesting that this particular child bears both. So vitiligo sort of gives you both, but still, we read her body as an African, as a Black person. So I just found those contradictions. I found them to be quite interesting. And again, it's not necessarily an image where I'm trying to pin down specific meanings, because we can only speculate what could have happened in that moment that the photograph was taken. But it's for me, there's something that feels like there's a deliberateness in placing those two together in the way that they have. And I just found it to be quite interesting. And then the mother on the other side, Umasfane Sane too, she of course has albinism, and of course skin looks very different. It is a sort of contrast, very different to the child that she's carrying. And yet again, you have this, she's dressed in this, what would have been associated with Christianized, civilized. So again, you have a very sort of clear sense of these painted backdrops, staged sort of theatrical images that we're looking at. And I guess that's for me, it was just, let's leave, what happens when we sit in those open questions of these very deliberate juxtapositions, especially in the construction of racial difference, which these images would have been used for.
Yeah, thank you. And I do want to ask a question, but I want to acknowledge we have gotten a Q&A, so please continue to pop those in the Q&A function or the chat, and we'll make sure to get to them. But I had one more or two more that I wanted to sneak in. Going to the idea of, these photographs being staged. I've loved what you've written about photography as a medium and the truthfulness of images. You've written that, quote, although it seems to concern itself with concrete reality and truth, photography is a malleable medium. Photography reveals, informs, and documents, but can also lie. The contradictions of photography, its malleability between truth and fiction, make it an incredible but also challenging medium to work with. And your work, your series explores this contradiction in colonial photography, but I wonder if you could also talk about whether or how you see this being true today, perhaps with things like Photoshop or social media, or even in just reflecting, like you said, in the years between when the series was created and now.
Yeah, I mean, I think what this work and making it has taught me is that, with photography, we now have to remind ourselves that its truths are not always apparent. So with photography, you have to look at, yes, what's in it, but you also have to think about what's outside of it and what's not necessarily visible to you. And the reason why I say that the series has taught me that, it's because at each stage of making it, I had to start speculating on the moment, and I had to start placing where the photographer would have been, how all of these things would have been moved around before the actual moment was taken. And again, now starting to see the fictions, with the ones where they say, oh, it probably wasn't taken in the date that we think it was taken because slavery was already abolished, or the other ones where you see the backdrops, so all of those things, you begin to see how this interplay between truth and fiction, but in today's world, really, what is truth? Because we often think of truths as things that are absolute, existing somewhere for us to find, and yet we all know that often the way we take things to be true has to always be confirmed by someone else calling it true. So it's like it's got to be a collective belief, a common perception for us to say, yes, it is true. But of course, we know that that's a very volatile space. It's a very political space. And so, I think these photographs just remind us how quickly things, an idea or concept like truth can shapeshift into something else. But also how we've come to understand history as truth, whereas it's a set of fictions. I mean, I was looking at the way that these images were inscribed. I hated the fact that I couldn't get the truth about the names of each of these subjects. I can't get the truth about where exactly this photograph was taken. I can't get any truth about when exactly it was taken. But what I'm seeing inscribed are some very broad and very abstract ideas about a Zulu woman waiting for a love. I mean, it sounds like a soapy, right? But when you encounter them within institutions of knowledge and truth, because that's where it's like the colonial photograph. This is a Zulu woman. That's what a Zulu woman looks like. That's what, these images sort of functioned to tell people, this is what Zulu garb looks like. This is how Zulu people dress. This is what a Zulu child, it worked to teach people about, specific cultures and specific traditions. And they come across as very scientific things. Some of them are numbered, it's like a kind of scientific categorization of who people are. And yet at the same time, it's like some of them are just really interesting fictions. If the woman is waiting for her lover and posing, it's just like, it's incredible to think about that as role play, but also at the same time to kind of work in that minefield of the power dynamic. But I mean, as you say, today, of course, we have all sorts of other technologies of constructing both, this sort of things that we know. And I'm trying to steer clear of the word truth. But you're right. Yes, there's the manipulation of images. We live in a world where, images are manipulated all the time. There are all sorts of, techniques for manipulating what we see. But I think for me, it's more around being able to navigate the shifting meanings, the process of meaning. The photographs are never the same thing the second time you look. It's the same, it's never the same. It's never the same. For me, at least, that was the experience. There was a time where it felt like I'm looking at one thing now, and the second time around, I'm seeing something else. And second time around, I'm seeing something else. And I think we have to enable ourselves to navigate that shifting territory, and of constantly questioning ourselves, our beliefs, because of course that's the locale of what we seem to understand as truth in the world, is of course that everybody can confirm your truth, but yeah.
And if I may share a personal anecdote, when I was in college, let's say, I learned about Civil War photography that had been manipulated, in that bodies were, staged to appear a certain way in that photograph. And I remember my mind just being blown at how, images could have been manipulated even then without things like Photoshop. And so I think, especially as, you know, we become even more able to manipulate images with technology, it seems like photographs from the past, like they didn't have Photoshop, this must be true. But we have to always keep questioning, you know, from whose perspective, what are the power dynamics? And as you said, what truths are not apparent? So I want to get to some audience questions. Thank you all again for submitting. Please keep sending them. Could you tell us your thoughts on how to approach archives, considering the silences of them and the dangers of constructed histories?
Considering can you say that again?
Silences of them and the dangers of constructed histories.
That is such an important question. I mean, you know, the thing with archives is that they always reflect other values, right? It's not, sometimes it's the values is not inherent in the thing itself. It's, you have to think about the more sort of institutional construction of value. So what is selected, what is kept, what's preserved, and what's not, what's discarded. And I guess that's what you mean, you know, by the silences. What do we do with where the gaps are, with the fragments? And I really, you know, I love the idea of us allowing ourselves to sit in the silences, but to also work with the fact that when we are approaching archives, we are not approaching something that will always be coherent. I mean, I think, you know, at least when I was studying, it's, you know, there's the frustration that I'm trying to find this thing, but I can't find all of it. And I want to see it all in full. And I'm frustrated that I can't see it all in full, and I can't make it coherent if I don't find the rest of it. I'm finding bits and pieces. And I don't know what to do with it if it's not full and if it's not complete. So what do I do with those gaps? And often we try and just fill them in, you know, through speculation and all of this. And I think that's fine. You know, I mean, I think speculation is healthy because it helps us sort of play around with what it is we're looking at, play around with multiple meanings. And so I think, yeah, I think that this incoherence of the archive, the incompleteness of the archive, is something that we have to accept. But also the violence that it symbolizes. I think those silences are sometimes very cacophonous. You know, so it's a silence that signifies something else. So it's a silence, and I'm going to use Ndobego's term here. It's a silence that signifies an absenting. It's not that there's a silence and it's like it's not there because it's simply just not there. It's not there because it was taken out. Something was done to it. And so even if there's a silence or an emptiness, it's an emptiness that seems to signal or signify violences. And so I guess there is a measure of caution that one kind of has to have when approaching archives. And yet at the same time, it's almost as if they are inviting us to allow ourselves to dwell in that emptiness, in that incompleteness and incoherence. And, you know, but again, I mean, I think, yeah, it's one of those very difficult, you know, it's a very difficult, for me, it's always been a very difficult relationship with what is found, but also what is signified by the things that we're looking at, what we can't find, and the things that seem to just not be there. But yeah, as I'm getting to a point where I'm repeating myself. I hope
thank you.
That question.
And then that was a great question and a great response. Thank you. So thinking about exhibiting these works. In Embodied, your work hangs next to a photograph by Zanele Muholi, who is also a contemporary South African artist. And you've written about their work and the series that the photograph we currently have on view, Sfikile in Nuoro, Italy, is a part of. Sonyama Gonyama, Hail the Dark Lioness. Could you tell us a little bit about your work on Muholi, and if you're willing to share what you think about your photos being side by side?
Yeah. So Zanele Muholi's work I've really respected for a very long time. When I did my master's years ago, she was one of the two artists whom I focused on. So it was Zanele Muholi and Nicholas Hlobo. And it was because their work was posing this kind of subversion of the idea that queerness is un-African, and I saw there was, I think that was the title of my thesis. It was like, It's Just an African, which was a play, which was a kind of questioning of this idea that some things can be African and others not. But I mean, it's so absurd to think of queerness as un-African, and that Zanele Muholi had gone into spaces that were often rarely documented, where queerness was rarely documented, which is the Black townships that were created in the 1950s by the apartheid government. So I really enjoyed, I really loved the way that it sort of surfaced the everydayness of queerness, of Black queerness in Black townships, but also the intersections with class. So I think, it kind of, my love for Zanele goes a long way. The most recent series, Somnyama Ngonyama, there's an article that I wrote recently because I think this work has been for me really difficult to engage. And I think it has to do with this epidermalization of race. The Somnyama Ngonyama series, when it started, there was very kind of marked darkening of the skin, but also the sort of use of objects. So either, the objects are in the head, or the objects are held, or the objects sort of, about Zanele's face. And for me, what's been difficult has been this question around, what does this do? And I see this, I think this is becoming a kind of recurrent aesthetic of, sort of hyper darkening of the skin. And of course, the first thing that one thinks of is blackface minstrelsy. And that was my initial response a few years ago when I first saw the series, was that I'm trying to understand whether this darkening of the skin is meant to subvert blackface minstrelsy, or if it simply plays into it. And again, it's a question I couldn't answer. But again, I think it's something that I bring in because there was another article that was written about the darkening of the skin as a way to think about Black aesthetics. And so it was about how we aestheticize Blackness. But then again, is Blackness something that can be aestheticized in terms of, skin, in terms of surface, in terms of objects? And I wondered if the work of documenting Black queerness in specifically Black townships, and the kind of advocacy, I think, that made that work so crucial and so valuable was carried through in the Somnyama Ngonyama series. So, I think it's to have the work side by side is actually introducing a very interesting conversation where you have the woman with the albinism. So perhaps the photographer was thinking about a whitening of the Black subject. Now, remember, civilization was like, you want the Black subjects to be Black subjects, but you don't want them to you want them to be civilized, to act like and mimic the white man, as it were. Sorry, I'm doing inverted commas. And in the other side, you have Zanele Moholi, where you have this blackening, hyper black. And I remember she's not using tar or anything, it's Photoshop. So, she's being intentional about this darkening of the skin. So I think it's an interesting juxtaposition, because on one hand, you have this sort of whitening, and on the other hand, you have a darkening. Now, obviously, the two didn't happen with the same kind of intention or in the same way. The woman with an albinism wasn't necessarily kind of photoshopped to look that way. But I think it's a very interesting conversation around the way that we take and understand, or at least explore, what is happening within the arts in the representation of race, and particularly the representation of Black bodies. And I'm wondering if in this kind of aesthetic, are we regressing to a particular reading of the body as inscription, or are we continuing in the subversion of the colonial image? And I think there was a point where I thought about it as a kind of cultural prison. So we kind of bound to particular images of Black bodies, that even in our subversion of them, there's a kind of predicament where we both could be subverting them, but yet at the same time, we kind of tied in the cycle of representing them, of recurrence, of restaging. And again, it's not, I think it's kind of like there's a very interesting conversation that's being brought up, a very difficult one too. I mean, even for myself, even for my own work, it's a very difficult one, because one begins to understand that there's an irony, but there's also a predicament in thinking about the ways in which we appear, the ways in which we choose to appear in our works, both as artists, but also as the bodies on display. And we need to think, we need the time for introspection, for what this means, especially because of the prevalence of it in many artists' work, currently.
Yeah, thank you for speaking to that. And I don't know if I mentioned, but what kind of ties the show Embodied together is that artists are using their own body in their work. And that's because I was just so captivated by the way that meaning is ascribed to bodies, and that when artists choose to use their own body in their work, they are drawing upon long and complicated histories and asking us to think about them, to challenge them. And in researching both you and Zanele Moholi, I came across your essay. I was like, what? Yeah, thank you. I'm glad we have a chance to actually further discuss it. And I do want to make sure we get to another question from a student. Could you talk a bit about how your upbringing has informed your artistic practice?
Wow. That's a nice question. That's really amazing. Yeah, I would have never thought about my upbringing having shaped my art, but actually it has. I was raised in an industrial town, which is south of Johannesburg. It's very polluted. So not necessarily a really nice place, factories everywhere, not much art happening, no galleries to speak of. And in fact, I think my choice of doing art, people looked at me and said, but where are you going to work? So I had to leave the place where I grew up, and I had to go to the Eastern Cape, to then start really just kind of practicing. But I was, and I mean, I think, with the part of my life, I grew up in the Black townships and Black schools, and there was no art. And then after 1994, I was moved to what they call the Model C schools, which then that's when I was introduced to art. But I realized, of course, that art has been there all the time. It's just I never thought about it. But both my parents were teachers. They were educated. They were both they both became headmasters of different schools in Black townships. But I've also just discovered that area where I was raised was also one of the areas where which wasn't it wasn't a typical township that was constructed in the 1950s. It was a place that was owned, where Black people owned land. And so what happens is that there's this massive archive of photographs that were taken by Black photographers in the early 1900s that we're starting to dig into now, starting to look at. I mean, these are images that I started really discovering last year. But again, I mean, it's just such an interesting connection in terms of the work I'm doing now, or that project in Everton. And I guess, the presence of the arts. And I think that question that you've just asked just makes me realize, actually, the presence of the arts has always been there. But if I answered this question 10 years ago, I would have said, well, no, my upbringing has nothing to do with my practice, but it probably has everything to do with my practice. And I think it's that kind of history writing that both my parents have been trying to do, because they've been trying to work with the history of that place. And I've come to this new archive mainly because of a manuscript that they tried to put together, a handwritten manuscript that they worked on before they passed on. So I think it has everything to do with it. And there's so much more, and I'll probably sound very incoherent when I talk about my upbringing. But
No, that's great. And thank you for the student who submitted that question. We're coming to a close for our hour, unfortunately, but I'd love to maybe hear from you, like what you're working on, what else you're working on, and the ways in which your artistic practice and work as a scholar and a professor might influence each other, if at all.
Yes. So I, as a scholar, as I've mentioned, I'm working on this project on Everton, and again, we're working through, the family albums that people have, the rich archives that people have, which is very difficult to work with because people don't trust anymore. But it's been a very interesting project in changing the way that we think about, what township lives were like. But I mean, for a place like Everton, where there were institutions that were built, major sort of schools, colleges that were built there, which would be really just something that is out of the something that's really unusual in what we see. Black townships really, there wasn't, that those places were constructed such that institutions like the ones we see in Everton would have never existed. So that project has been really interesting for me. It's a very difficult one, but I think a very, very, very important one to do in terms of understanding place, but also, of course, the land question that comes with it. And then as a professor, I mean, I think in the work that I do right now, which will sound really unrelated, is the work that I'm doing on transformation. In some ways, I guess it is related, but I was part of the Black Academic Caucus a few years ago. And then in 2020, I started a 3-year term as the Deputy Dean of Transformation. Those positions were new, and they were meant to address the structural racism in universities in South Africa, but also addressing the question of the changing or transformation of institutional culture. So really a lot of my work in the past 3 years has, really focused on questions around equity and questions around diversity, inclusivity, justice, social justice work, and then, of course, dealing with conflict within the university. Not that, I think, as I said, it sounds really unrelated, but I guess where the relation is in this questioning of how institutions function. And I think a lot of the images we see, institutions construct these ideas, they construct these perceptions. So for me, it's really an important space to work with, institution building and institution changing, because that's where not only knowledge is produced, that's where knowledge is validated and legitimized. And we need to start to question about not only what is legitimized and what is validated, but what is the accountability that these institutions have to the societies in which they are located. And for me, that's really been the work. And I think that's how it connects to some of the projects that I'm working on. And then there's another one, a platform, which is called Creative Knowledge Resources, that I started in 2018, and I've been working on it with my colleague, Amogelang Maledu. And together we've been trying to create conversations, not only in terms of, artists who come from institutions, but not only conversations, but also collaborations, but also working outside of the institution so that we bridge that gap. And also at least create a space of resource sharing. And it's still in its nascent stages. So, I think a lot of what we say is like the ideal. It's not always easy to achieve, but that's I think that those three things, if one can kind of try and see how they linked together, it all sort of falls in this question of transforming institutions towards social justice.
Thank you. And I think that is the perfect note to kind of wrap up and end on, as an academic museum nestled within a university, interacting with students who are understanding about the production of knowledge and the validation of knowledge. And, you've given us so much to think about. We so appreciate your time and your willingness to talk with us amidst all these projects you have going on. And we'll certainly make sure to send you photos of the 2024 exhibition that will feature your self-portrait project.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and all our participants, thank you so much for your questions. I really appreciate it, because I think it also just helps me, question myself, but grow a little bit more. So I'm truly grateful. Thank you to both Isadora and Sharon for inviting me to this.
Thank you. Thank you all for tuning in, and have a great rest of your day if you're on the East Coast here, and have a great evening, Nomusa. Thank you again.
Thank you. Bye.